Of CODEPINK Congress. I am so thrilled that you're with us tonight. I welcome you all. We have a very exciting program planned. Our featured guest is John Kiriakou, a former CIA whistleblower on the CIA torture program. We also hope to have with us Zahra Billoo, who is the executive director of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. We're talking about authoritarianism at home and abroad. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I do invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, where you're from. If you know who represents you in Congress, let us know any affiliations you want to share. We also ask that you respect our norms. They're pretty simple. Show respect for our speakers and participants. Encourage healthy debate, disagree agreeably in the chat. Any kind of disrespect just won't be tolerated, and let's organize, mobilize for peace with justice. So with that, I would like to share with you a few videos to sort of set the stage for our conversation with John. These are videos of some of those who have been critical of U.S. foreign policy, not only on Israel, but also on Ukraine and Russia, and the kind of repression that they are facing. So with that, let's look at the first video.
From a Paris jail, a social media titan walks away from a detention that has rocked cyberspace. Pavel Durov may not be a household name in the West, but in Russia, the former Soviet world, Africa, and the Middle East, his social media platform Telegram is a giant with more than 900 million users.
We care about freedom. Even our logo, the paper airplane, symbolizes freedom to move in 3 dimensions.
Durov's been released on 5 million euros bail, but must now stay in France and face charges that his platform has allowed criminal activity. Lev Gershenson was the head of news for Russia's largest search engine, Yandex. Now in Germany, like many, he's aware of Telegram's reputation.
It's been used when people illegally are buying drugs, grass, marijuana, or some other dark things.
Those other dark things include allegations of child pornography and fraud. French President Emmanuel Macron has defended the extraordinary step of arresting the head of a social media platform for the content it carries.
La France est un pays qui protège la liberté d'expression.
He said France is a country that protects freedom of expression, and it protects and values innovation and entrepreneurs. He said France is also a country of rule of law. At the heart of the French charges are allegations Telegram simply didn't respond to French inquiries about illegal activities on its platform.
The main accusation is that they were refusing to cooperate. And I believe that the refusal to cooperate means primarily the refusal to communicate properly.
Pavel Durov has earned a reputation for fiercely resisting any oversight of Telegram.
We at Telegram love blockchain.
He is somewhat of an enigma. He left Russia a decade ago after refusing to reveal the identities of communities of his hugely popular VK social media site. The Kremlin forced him to sell, and he relocated to Dubai and gained UAE and French citizenship. He has transformed himself professionally and physically.
By the way, it's my first public appearance and my first.
He runs one of the world's most popular apps, but his image is tightly controlled.
His Durov's appearances, the public appearances, I would say from the European and from the Western perspective, they're kind of weird. I mean, this latest interview with Tucker Carlson.
Well, thank you for joining us. Well, thank you for having me.
In that interview in April with the conservative broadcaster, Jurov shed some light on Telegram's pushback to attempts to control activity on the platform.
The rules themselves, they're pretty general, right? So there must be no violence, discrimination, publicly available, I don't know, child abuse materials. It's hard to disagree with that.
Yes.
But then when they start to apply those rules, sometimes we are not agreeing with their interpretation.
Российское посольство во Франции потребовало у Франции.
Jurov's detention was big news in Russia. The Kremlin was quick to point the finger, alleging this was another example of the West stifling free speech.
Elon Musk is free, Mark Zuckerberg is free, but Pavel Durov is now in prison. Why? Because he's Russian. He's a Russian by nationality and he's Russian by his citizenship. So he has been traced as a person to be a scapegoat for the West as an evil Russian.
All right, so that's the first video on Durov, and I know that we'll be talking about his case with our guest, John Kiriakou. Now we have another video that we want to share. This one is with Glenn Greenwald talking to Richard Medhurst in the UK.
Richard Medhurst has become quite a popular independent journalist. He has a YouTube show where he's been working year after year, building an audience because he offers not just a scathing critique of orthodoxies of Western foreign policy, but an extremely informed critique. I can't imagine finding very many people who will be more enlightening about things like Western imperialism in Africa, or the war in Ukraine, or the war in Israel, or the Western role in all of that. He covered the Assange case extensively. Basically, he's doing what independent media is meant to do, which is offering perspectives in a very informed way that you can't get very many other places. And at the same time, doing so in a way that is steeped not in rhetoric or blowhard behavior, but just in very studied facts. And it's one of the things that has made his show so popular, not just among a large group of people who watch him, but also among myself. We've had him on our show before, and we are happy to have him back, although not necessarily under great circumstances. Richard, it's great to see you, even though it's not under great circumstances. Thanks for taking the time.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks so much for having me. And it's your words are very much appreciated.
Yeah, they're very genuine. So, all right, let's get to it. We talked a little bit about the beginning of the show, but for people who didn't hear, on Thursday of last week, you flew to the UK and you were met by 6 police officers at the plane. So before you could even get off the plane and get to immigration, and they essentially placed you under arrest, under physical custody of the UK police under a terrorism law of 2000, though they didn't really explain why. But you did about a 9-minute video going into great detail about the treatment to which you were subjected, which we will link to so that people can go watch the full story of that. But in lieu of that, can you tell me what it is during this arrest that lasted 24 hours that you were able to learn about why it is that you were being arrested?
Well, just from the get-go, I just want to say that I'm out on bail, effectively. So, you know, I'm not at liberty to divulge exactly what they asked me and go too much into detail. I think you can.
Let me just ask you: are you out on bail with restrictions, or have you had to surrender your passport? Or are you able to leave the country?
Yeah. So here's the thing: I was released on unconditional bail. I was given my passport back. The thing is, I do have to go back in 3 months and surrender myself to the police station. Although I don't feel that the bail really is unconditional, because, you know, essentially everything and anything I say, anything I do, it can be used against me. So, you know, it's like I think what they wanted to achieve is to silence me as a journalist and stop me doing my work. So, you know, they say it's unconditional, but it's not really unconditional, is it?
Richard Medhurst, arrested in the UK. You can watch him on Twitter, on Instagram. Our last video that we want to preface our show with is a video of a man you're probably familiar with, former Iraq weapons inspector Scott Ritter, whose home was raided by the FBI.
All right, as you guys have figured out, the FBI executed a search warrant at my residence. The search warrant is related to concerns apparently the U.S. government has about violations of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I will tell you right now, I am not in violation of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I have not done anything that to do it, and hopefully by executing the search warrant and taking the materials that they did, they will reach that conclusion. I will say that things like this have a chilling effect on free speech. There's no doubt that I'm being targeted because of statements I've made about U.S. policy in Ukraine. I'm being targeted because I have made an effort to try and improve relations between the United States and Russia, to try to bring about arms control, to bring about peace. Apparently somebody in the U.S. government takes umbrage of this, so they executed a search warrant. The FBI was extraordinarily professional. I have no complaints against the personnel that did this. I do have complaints against the personnel that caused this to happen. This has a chilling impact on free speech. The idea that you have a free speech right in America, when you execute it in a manner that the U.S. government takes exception to, and they launch a search warrant, that is an intimidation factor. I can say that I am not intimidated, and I will continue to speak out, and I will continue to do what I do, because that's my responsibility as an American citizen. And I continue to operate in that manner. So I think I gave you all the answers you need at this point in time. I would request that you respect that and let me and my wife get on with our business.
What time did they show up today?
All right, so those were videos with 3 people who have been targeted: Ritter, Medhurst, and Durov. And now I would like to introduce our first guest. It's my great pleasure to welcome John Kiriakou, a former CIA counterterrorism officer, former senior investigator with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. John became the 6th whistleblower indicted by the Obama administration under the Antiquated Espionage Act, a law designed to punish spies, a law that is so oppressive, those who are tried under it are not even allowed to explain their motivation. John Kiriakou served 23 months in prison as a result of his attempts to oppose the Bush administration's torture program. So welcome, John Kiriakou, to CODEPINK Congress.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be with you. And as a general rule, I never, ever say anything but yes to CODEPINK. And thank you for the work that you all do.
Well, I am very honored. Let me just say that. So John, tell us about your trip to Greece, what you were doing there, and what happened on your way back.
Yeah, I was working with the Greek government at their request on a new bill that would more strongly protect whistleblowers. The Greeks asked me back in 2015 to help them write a new whistleblower protection bill. I did that. It ended up passing in a weakened version. The original bill was then adopted by the European Parliament, and now the Greeks want to strengthen that old bill so that it matches the new European Union bill. So I went out for the sole purpose of talking to Greek think tanks. Now, think tanks in Greece are different than they are here in the United States, in that every one of the political parties that is represented in the Greek parliament has its own think tank. So they work together, they trade information, they trade ideas, they have seminars together. So they're all very friendly and very cooperative. But I wanted to make sure to get ideas from all across the political spectrum, from the right of center governing conservatives all the way over to the Communist Party on the left. So I did that, and it was great, and it was easy, and they treated me like a king, like they always do. And I took, 100 pages of notes. And because the Greek government was the entity that hired me to do this, they also paid for my airfare and my hotel. So they did it on the cheap. Now, I flew out on Delta from Washington to Kennedy, and then Kennedy to Athens nonstop. Flying back, it was Athens to Toronto and Toronto to Washington. So I was momentarily nervous because since I have a felony conviction here in the United States, that's considered to be a felony conviction in all of the Five Eyes countries. which is the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Five Eyes countries, in addition to an unfettered program of intelligence cooperation and sharing, also cooperate on and share criminal justice information. And so if you've committed a felony in any one of those 5 countries that required a jail or prison stay of 18 months or longer, you are banned for life from entering those countries. Now that's ridiculous. I went to Australia last year. I've been to the UK 5 times since I got out of prison. It's just kind of silly. So I wasn't really worried about it. And besides, remember, I never had any intention of entering Canada. I was just transiting Canada to get off one plane and then get on another plane for Washington. But when the plane landed in Toronto, I stood up like everybody else does. I waited my turn for the rows to clear. And just as I took the first step off the plane, 2 Mounties grabbed me by the upper arm. Come with us. That's all they said. And I tried to, be, easy about it. I said, well, what's up, guys? Nothing. Those were the only words they said. They'd be, come with us. They wouldn't look me in the eye. They wouldn't answer any of my questions. Nothing beyond come with us. So they took me from one plane to the other plane. I stood at the gate with them grabbing my arm on both arms. And then when the gate agent announced that the plane was ready to board, believe me when I say, for the first time in my life, I was the very first person on the plane, thanks to these guys. They took me onto the plane. I buckled myself in my seat, and then one of them said, stay there. And then they got off the plane. And I assume that they stood there at the gate to make sure I didn't get off. And the plane took off and I went to Washington. Now, when I arrived in Washington, of course, I go through customs and immigration, and they want to know, where were you and why were you there? And listen, those are normal questions. Who did you meet with? That's not a normal question. What's their contact information? Also not a normal question. And finally, I said, look, I'm not answering any questions. I'm represented by counsel. Well, we can hold you indefinitely. And I said, actually, no, you can't. I'm an American, and you cannot legally stop me from entering my own country. Well, we can make you sit here till midnight. And I said, you know what? I've gone through worse in my life, so knock yourselves out. And I waited another 45 minutes or so, and then they told me, get out. So I went, got my suitcase, and went home. And, in retrospect, now having looked at Richie Medhurst, Susan Wilkerson, Doug Bernard, I'm blanking, from Hawaii, Congresswoman.
Oh, yes, Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard. I'm sorry. Since she became a Republican, I can't remember her name anymore. Tulsi Gabbard. I ended up, getting it easy. Tulsi Gabbard has as many as 4 federal air marshals who ride on the plane with her because she's on this terrorist watch list. Richie Medhurst, let's talk about Medhurst for a minute. I'll add something. I went to Iceland in October to meet with WikiLeaks, and Craig Murray, Ambassador Craig Murray, the former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, who is a very important torture whistleblower in his own right. He met us there. And the day before we started our meetings with WikiLeaks, he went to a pro-Palestine public event. It was held outside. There were a few dozen people there. A couple had Palestinian flags, free Palestine, whatever. And so we all went to our meeting. We met for a second day. I flew back to Washington, and Craig flew to Scotland. He's from Scotland. As soon as my plane arrived in DC, I got a call from the head of WikiLeaks. And he said, I wasn't even through customs and immigration yet. The plane literally had just landed. So I answered it. And he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I just landed. I'm not having any problem. Why?" And he said, "Craig Murray was just arrested." I said, "For what?" He said, "I don't know. They charged him under Section 7 of the Terrorism Act." Well, Section 7 is kind of weak. It's that you said something or did something that somehow showed support for terrorism. It's a stupid section from a stupid law and a dangerous law. With that as background, Richard Medhurst was arrested and charged under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act. Section 12 is providing material support to a terrorist group. Now, what was the material support that Richie Medhurst provided? He wrote the truth from Gaza. That was his support for terrorism. By telling us the truth about women and children and elderly people being murdered in cold blood, he told us the truth about the fact that there is not one single functioning hospital for 2 million people in Gaza. He told us the truth about the Israeli army telling internal refugees and displaced persons to go to XYZ certain location because it's free passage to a safe zone, and then they bomb the safe zone. So it is his factual, on-the-ground reporting which caused him to be charged with what is essentially a capital crime. So when he tells Glenn that he can't speak freely because he's on bail, he really cannot speak freely. He's in danger of losing his freedom. Just this one single charge that they're threatening him with calls for 14 years in prison. And the British do it differently than the Americans do when it comes to prison sentences. Here in the United States, based on the severity of your crime, they'll put you in a minimum security camp, a low security prison, a medium security prison, or a maximum security penitentiary. That's not how the Brits do it. The Brits start everybody at maximum security, and the closer you get to the end of your sentence, they put you in a lower and lower and lower level. So he's talking about 14 years, beginning with hard time in the same kind of draconian conditions that Julian Assange had to endure. This is a very, very dangerous development. I see somebody has a question about Tulsi Gabbard. Why is Tulsi Gabbard on a terrorist watch list? We don't know. The government won't say. There were a couple of members of Congress, certainly the Hawaii delegation, and the chairman of the House, a Republican, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, demanding answers as to why she's on a terrorist watch list. And literally every single member of the Hawaii legislature voted yes on a resolution to demand an inquiry and an explanation as to why she's being punished and harassed like this. We don't know, but this is something that the government can do to you. Look at Scott Ritter. Listen, I'll tell you just on a personal level, I have spoken to my attorney about Scott Ritter a half a dozen times since the FBI raided his house, because, I appear on RT all the time. Scott appears on RT all the time. Occasionally, Scott will write an op-ed for RT, for which they pay him the magnificent whopping sum of $150. So does that mean he's an agent of the Russian government? Of course not, because if you read the FARA law, journalism is exempt from registration. So what is it exactly that they're accusing Scott of doing, unless they got a warrant to seize his electronics with the hope that once they're in his private business, they can find something that he did that they can charge him with, even if they can't charge him with a FARA violation. And I'll add one other thing about FARA. The Foreign Agent Registration Act was passed in the 1930s. It was passed in the 1930s because the government was afraid of Nazi sympathizers doing work here in the United States on behalf of the Nazi government in Germany. And so they said, if you do work for a foreign government or a foreign company and it's meant to influence policy in the United States, you have to register with the Department of Justice. There's an office of well, it's just called the Office of FARA. Now, normally the way this works is, I'll tell you what my own experience was. In 2008, I bid on a contract. I won a contract with the Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce to write 4 op-eds about how great Abu Dhabi is and what a great place it is to do business. So they gave me, I forget what, $3,000, $2,800. I wrote these 4 articles. We placed them in obscure business journals. I went to farah.gov and it took me literally 10 minutes to fill out the form. And I said, you know, I did this for the Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce, and here are links to the 4 pieces that I wrote. Enter, and it's done. That's all you have to do. As it turns out, I didn't necessarily have to do that, but I did it anyway, just to be on the safe side. Now, if you don't do it and you are in violation, the federal sentencing guidelines recommend a sentence of 0 to 6 months in jail and a $5,000 fine. 0 to 6 months. Now, you saw on the video a short interview with Maria Butina. Maria Butina was a grad student at American University here in Washington. She is a strong proponent of gun ownership, and she wanted to create a liaison relationship between the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and whatever the Russian version of the NRA is. She's strongly pro-Putin. She actually had a sticker of Putin's face on the back of her cell phone. Okay, who cares if she likes Putin or she doesn't like Putin? I don't care. Anyway, they accused her of violating FARA because they said that her activity, whereby she was trying to make this relationship between the NRA and the Russian version of the NRA, was a violation. They said, oh, you're doing it on behalf of the Russian government. She said, no, I'm not. I'm not an employee of the Russian government. I don't get paid by the Russian government. They said, oh, we don't believe you. Guilty. She went to trial, guilty. So with that 0 to 6 month sentencing guideline in mind, they gave her 18 months in solitary confinement. Every hour that she was in prison, she spent in solitary confinement. Now, of course, you all know, because you've probably heard me say it 10,000 times, the United Nations has deemed the US practice of solitary confinement to be a form of torture. Anything longer than 15 days in solitary confinement is considered by the United Nations to be torture. She was there for 18 months for failing to fill out an internet form. So my guess is this isn't about FARA. This is because they don't like Scott at the Department of Justice and at the State Department. They are looking to punish Scott because he's very outspoken in his support of Russia in the war with Ukraine. And they're looking to make an example of him. And it's not just us. As bad as we are, we don't have the draconian laws that the UK has. We don't have an Official Secrets Act. We don't have a terrorism act. Not like the Brits, where you can just charge anybody whose politics you don't like with a felony. So I think that's what this is. I think this is a concerted and coordinated effort by the American, British, Australian, probably Canadian, let's just say the Five Eyes governments, to squelch dissent, to silence people whose political views, especially on Gaza and on Ukraine, don't fit in the mainstream. And they're not going to stop until either the courts tell them to, or until everyone that they consider to be a dissident is incarcerated. Thanks for letting me rant.
Thank you, John. And I have a lot of questions. Others do as well.
Sure.
We'll come back to you after we bring on Zahra Billoo. She's our next guest on CODEPINK Congress. I'm Marcy Winograd. Welcome all of you. Zahra is a civil rights attorney who serves as the executive director of the Council on American Islamic Relations, San Francisco Bay Area, the nation's largest American Muslim civil rights organization. Beyond her title, Zahra describes herself as an American Muslim woman, the daughter of immigrants, who was politicized as a civil rights activist post 9/11, her first year in college. CARE is a member of a California statewide coalition to beat back bills to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and suppress dissent on college campuses. Zahra is here to tell us a bit about that struggle, as well as nationwide, what's happening with the silencing of voices for Palestine. Welcome, Zahra.
Thank you so much, Marcy. To you for everything you do as an individual leader and an activist. I just love actually seeing you on Zoom as opposed to on Twitter and Facebook, as well as to CODEPINK. I messaged a friend the other day and I said, if I could have any job that isn't my job right now, I would probably want to do CODEPINK full time. I love how you all are holding our leaders accountable and mobilizing so many people along the way. So thank you. Gosh, we saw like a student uprising of historic levels in the last 11 months, but really like in the school year. I, as a West Coaster, always like to say it began with Stanford University. Stanford University had the first sit-in against the genocide, which became an encampment. And they actually started in November of 2023, months before Columbia. Don't let any New Yorkers tell you otherwise. They did that for day in and day out until they reached an agreement with their university. The university then reneged on the agreement, but needless to say that their first encampment closed at some point in early 2024. And then of course we saw what happened at Columbia. There's a Mexican proverb that I love. They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. And so when Columbia came down brutally on its students, and we're so happy that that president has been shown the door, when Columbia came down brutally on its students, they thought that they would quash the student mobilization. And instead what they did is inspired so many more encampments. I mean, I think we were seeing 1 or 2 new encampments per day for several weeks. And eventually there were encampments on every continent. Somebody dared say that Antarctica did not have an encampment on a college campus. And within a week, Antarctica put one up, which is saying something. While we continued, right, students, alumni, and so on, to mobilize and organize after graduation season, I want to make sure that we know that so too were our counterparts on the pro-genocide camp, right, and the pro-genocide mobilization. And so groups like Hillel and the Anti-Defamation League were working behind the scenes to convince university administrators, not that it took a lot of convincing, to clamp down on mobilizations. And so we've seen a number of different things happen as students are headed back to the fall semester. One of the ones that I think is most notable and coming up is more universities have tightened their time, place, manner restrictions. So they've gone back to their traditional, classic, legacy free speech zones and implemented more rules on how students can use those, right? So universities, for example, that did not have prohibitions explicitly on encampments now have those prohibitions, right? Universities that did not have a permitting process that was very rigid have tightened those up. And so we've seen that in Florida, we've seen it in Maryland, we've seen it in New York, and we've of course seen it in California and so many places in between. 2 other things that we have seen is the ongoing targeting of organizations and the speakers that the campus organizations bring, right? So we saw this beginning last year, but a number of universities outright banned Students for Justice in Palestine chapters. And then others, and by the way, we spend a lot of time on universities, but I want to mention we're seeing a lot of this in high schools as well, right? And so high schools and colleges are now also saying, well, we need to approve your speakers, right? So putting students through rigorous vetting processes that were not required prior. The last thing I'll say before talking a little bit about what we've seen in California is we are seeing new mask restrictions. So somebody highlighted that there was an inability to pursue the criminal charges against the students at Columbia University who took over and renamed one of the buildings Hens Hall, because the students both covered up the cameras really quickly, but also covered up their faces throughout the process. So there was never enough identifying information. Like, you couldn't figure out who it was. Even if they ended up in cuffs later, how do you know that that's the person on video? And so as a result, we've seen universities introducing mask bans. And we've actually seen opposition to these bans from disability rights groups who are saying, wait a second, right? Like, people wear masks for a variety of reasons. And one, of course, you're quelling free speech, but also what about students who have health challenges and who need to mask for their own safety? There's also a religious objection to these mask bans, right? Some Muslim women choose to cover their faces as a form of practicing their modesty. And so a student group asked us this question recently. They said, are these new policies legal? The way I explained it is, I don't doubt that these colleges and universities consulted with large teams of overpaid lawyers. I don't doubt it. What we need now is for people to step forward and challenge the implementation of these policies. And one theory is that may be where the legal challenge arises, right? To say that somebody from one background was treated one way and somebody from another background was treated another way. But we're also curious if the colleges and universities put these policies on the books so that they could appease Zionist organizations that are pressuring them, so that they could appease law enforcement officials that are pressuring them, but that they won't actually enforce them. Time will tell. The other thing related to this that I want to make sure everyone here is aware of is that our legislators, in many cases, in California this is the case, but I imagine it's true across the country, our legislators have also been working around the clock to put forward legislation that is responsive to the Israeli genocide in Gaza, but it's pro-Israel legislation. Now, what always surprises people in California, at least, is you get this from Democrats, you get this from people on the left, you get this from people who have been our allies on so many things, but right now are putting forward legislation that is very problematic. In California, there are 3 bills that made it through the complex legislative process and are now sitting on the governor's desk. One of them, SB 1277, sounds really good. They all sound really good on their surface. SB 1277 says we need to make sure students are learning about genocide. Grades 7 through 12 need to learn about genocide. However, the way they're managing that is that they are taking that curriculum out of the hands of ethnic studies professionals and instead giving it to third-party advocacy groups that are on the record supporting Israel, that are on the record minimizing the impact of Israeli violence. Genocide education is important, but it should be led by professionals who are actually experts on the issues and not biased. There's SB 1287. It seeks to order the CSU university system, one of our largest university systems in the state of California and across the country even, to adopt codes of conduct and enforce them. This is challenging because what we have here is the legislature intervening in university affairs and insisting that the university regulate its students through vague and arbitrary codes of conduct, which we know is one additional way of repressing student advocacy and speech. And then the last one, AB 2925, would require public higher education institutions to train students on bias and discrimination. But here again, the source is the problem. It wants the institutions to rely on law enforcement data to determine what types of bias are most common. Now, in case this wasn't obvious to you, people of color, immigrants, minorities, and politically marginalized groups do not call law enforcement at the same rate as other groups. And so Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism are significantly underreported to law enforcement. So using law enforcement data to inform anti-bias education takes a really good idea and ruins it, as we saw with these other bills. All of these bills are on the governor's desk. That means that they made it all the way through the complex vetting process in the California legislature. And so for people in California, I dropped a link in the chat that is a how to contact your legislators. But I wanted to wrap up by offering a couple of just very specific steps. If I could scroll up and find my chat. Okay, the first is, if you have a National Lawyers Guild chapter in your area, reach out to them. They are constantly training legal observers. If you want to help protect students at protests, if you want to help protect protesters in general, legal observer training is a really good way to do it. Whether you want to sign up to be an official observer or you just want the skills, I think it's key knowledge to have. And then stay in touch with JVP, Palestine Legal, and CARE to support efforts in order to protect students. All three organizations are working on student issues. Follow the Students for Justice in Palestine and MSA chapters in your area to learn about when students are organizing on campuses, right? Having an extra 10 or 20 people from the community at a student protest insulates it, adds witnesses, right? And makes it a bigger event. Here's one thing that I think a lot of us overlook. Check in with your alma mater, right? So if you graduated from any of these universities that are getting this wrong, when you write to them as an alumni, right, and you say, maybe you were only donating a little bit every year, maybe you were donating a lot, but threaten with your donation. Get other alumni to write to the university. These are places that rely on their alumni networks for their success in a variety of ways. And so don't neglect your campus, right? Where you went to undergraduate, where you went to graduate school or otherwise. You may not have been in touch for a long time, but write to them, say class of 09, class of 06, class of 93, whatever it is for you. Do that, don't neglect it. And then the last thing is the link I mentioned. I'll drop all of these points again. And if you're in California, definitely send that letter that JVP is organizing people to send. They tried to bury us. They did not know that we were seeds. The longer and more vociferously we protect student advocacy, the bigger the movement grows, the more influence it has, the more visibility it has. Ultimately, I take my inspiration from the 22-year-olds who need 3 hours of sleep per day, who can survive on a diet of chips and ice cream, and who are unapologetically committed to this cause, even when it means putting their own well-being at risk.
Thank you so much, Zahra Billoo, who is the Executive Director of the Council on American Muslim Relations, CARE, in San Francisco. And we're also going to bring back John Kiriakou, the CIA whistleblower on the CIA torture program, to take questions from the chat, as well as questions that I'll pose or questions they want to pose of each other. So I just want to add a footnote to Zahra's terrific presentation, and that is that in California, we were able to beat back a bill that would have made it virtually impossible to incorporate Palestinian Americans in the ethnic studies curriculum. And ultimately, the authors pulled their bill and said, oh, we'll come back next year. Well, we have to make sure they don't. But that was a victory for this year. And this has been an ongoing struggle in California, where there's been a battle over the ethnic studies curriculum, which was purged by the state of references to Palestine and Palestinian Americans, and triggered local districts such as Los Angeles, where the members of the teachers union were introducing their own ethnic studies curriculum to address the gaps in the state adopted curriculum. All right, with that, I'm going to ask John a question. John, you went to Greece and you attended a conference on the Middle East. Clearly, you must have talked about Israel. What came up at that conference? I know that activists have been pushing for the Greek government to stop shipping military fuel to Israel. So I'm wondering if that was discussed at all.
No. What was discussed was a real break between the conservative government and all the other political parties. This is something that has mystified me in recent years. The Greek government, historically, going back decades, generations, had very close ties to Palestine, to Palestinian political movements, to Fatah, to the PLO, even to liberation groups like the PFLP or the DFLP. Those ties were especially strong during periods of socialist governments in Greece, PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement. And then the Greek government collapsed in 2008. Not collapsed, the Greek government didn't collapse, the Greek economy collapsed in 2008. And just around the same time, a massive sea of natural gas was found off the southern and eastern coasts of Cyprus. Now, this gas field is so enormous, the Titan field, it stretches all the way to, well, the coast of Gaza in the south, halfway to Egypt, and then just a little branch off to Lebanon. And the Greeks saw dollar signs, I'm sorry to say. And they decided back in 2008, 2009 to throw their lot in with the Israelis. They did that for a couple of reasons. As Israel's relationship with Turkey devolved into one of hatred, the Greeks saw that as an opportunity for themselves, because you know the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There's nobody on earth that the Greeks hate more than the Turks. And if the Turks are going to hate on the Israelis, then the Greeks are going to start to love on the Israelis. I hate to be so crass about it, but that was really the conversation that was happening there. The Greeks thought, wow, well, if we're close to the Israelis, they can help us develop this gas field. We'll make lots of money. We'll be able to sell arms to them. You know, what small arms industry the Greeks have. And, you know, what have the Palestinians ever gotten us but grief from the Americans for supporting Palestinian rights? Again, I hate to be so crass, but that's really the way they lay it out. Now, that's the conservative New Democracy Party. Every other party represented in the Greek parliament supports Palestinian political and human rights. And this is really tearing people apart. That, you know, we were with the Palestinians for 70 years until we weren't anymore. Like, how do we explain that to people? And the truth is, they were just so desperate for economic development. And the fact that the Turks made it easy for them by taking on the Israelis, they just jumped into bed with the Israelis.
Thank you for that explanation. I had no idea.
It's awful.
About the context, it is awful. No wonder it's been so hard to stop the shipments of military fuel from Greece to Israel.
And well, and another thing, if I could just add one thing and interrupt you, I'm sorry for that. The same situation is what we're seeing with Greece vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. You know, Russia is an Orthodox Christian country. Greece is an Orthodox Christian country. It's official for both countries that it's in the Constitution. It's the official religion of the country. And Ukraine is Orthodox, but it's also Catholic. And then the U.S. went to Greece and said, look, you know, if you send all of your old weapon systems and weapons to Ukraine, we'll replace everything new with all the updated weapons and systems. We'll do it for free. And the Greeks said, well, we've had this close relationship with the Russians, you know, since the 40s. And the Americans said, we'll pay you for it. And they took the money.
Follow the money, right? The old cliche. Zahra, I wanted to ask you about CARE being the largest American Muslim organization in the United States. What kind of calls are you getting now in terms of complaints or requests? What are you hearing on the other end?
That's a great question. The look on my face is frustration with the answer, not with you. We are seeing a 30-year high in complaints of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. And we want to distinguish, of course, simple definition is hatred against Muslims or those who are mistaken or perceived to be Muslim. Anti-Palestinian racism may have similar targets, but can also be different, right? So Palestinians experience anti-Palestinian racism when their identities are silenced, when their history is erased, and or when they face violence for advocating for Palestine. We are also seeing anti-Palestinian racism, of course, targeting our Jewish allies and others. But 2023 marked the worst year in all of 30 years that we have compiled data. It's worse than the Trump era. It's worse than post 9/11. And we're seeing it across the country, right? We're seeing it across the country and at all levels. Elected officials, right? Traditionally progressive elected officials have been unapologetic in their support for Israel and in their minimization of the Israeli genocide. We've seen it at universities with, of course, the violent targeting of protesters who are treated much worse when they're advocating for Palestine than when they're advocating for Israel. We've seen school bullying on campuses, as well as Arab and Palestinian families saying that they don't feel safe, right? Wearing what they want to wear and bringing their culture and perspectives to schools. We've seen violent hate crimes, right? So even again in progressive pockets like the San Francisco Bay Area, we've seen hit and runs, we've seen assaults. Last October, I'll tell you two specific stories. So last October, there was a group of girls in Monterey, California, right? Small beach town, maybe an hour south of where I'm based, who were writing Free Gaza in the sand. And a military veteran, Max Steiner, approached them, messed up their artwork in the sand, grabbed one of the girls' cell phones, and allegedly attempted to choke one of the young girls. Bad enough that, he's initially refusing to plead guilty on the criminal charge side. We filed civil suit. And his attorneys and he had the audacity to take the position that his actions were protected by the First Amendment. And of course, the court found, for those of you that are like litigators, you may be familiar with like anti-SLAPP laws. The court agreed with us that we were in the right to sue him. But the fact that somebody would even file that on his behalf is left us aghast. So it's one example. Another example, and the last thing I'll say is about, we're seeing this in workplaces. So imagine working for Google or Apple or NVIDIA or Meta or X or Adobe or Kaiser or Sutter. These are all major employers, and we have received complaints from employees at every single one of them. The complaints range from harassment by Israeli colleagues. Many of these tech companies have offices in Israel. We've received complaints of censorship, right? So you've got these unfiltered, unregulated, unmoderated internal Slack channels and teen channels. And the moment somebody says something about Palestine, when they've been talking about everything all day, including Israel, all of a sudden the channel gets shut down or somebody gets disciplined. Just today, we went public with a complaint on behalf of a nurse who wore a Free Palestine badge reel. So for those of you that have jobs where you badge in, I didn't know what a badge reel was, but it's like the little sort of thing that holds the badge. She put Free Palestine on her badge. Can you imagine how small that is? Her colleagues said Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, all these things. She was told to remove it or quit her job. And so she was essentially forced out of her job because she put Free Palestine on a badge reel. And so we filed a complaint on her behalf. But it can sound really overwhelming. What I always come back to is one, report everything, right? If you're not sure if it's serious, if you're not sure if it's bad, let the lawyers and the advocates do that part of this. We are not in the business of crying wolf where there isn't discrimination, but let us discern, right? Is it discrimination? Were your rights violated? So report everything to CARE, to Palestine Legal. Bring the ACLU folks in, right? Just make sure that you're telling someone and you're not just quietly accepting abuse as normal. And we, like with the student advocacy, we have power in numbers. So if 5 people wear their keffiyeh to work, that's a lot stronger than if one person wears their keffiyeh to work. If 5 people advocate, through the Parent-Teacher Association at a local school for ethnic studies, it's a lot stronger than one person. And so it's bad, but it's countered by how many people are mobilizing and speaking up right now.
That's right. Thank you, Zahra. And I'm reminded, a friend just sent me an email that San Francisco State, which is part of the Cal State system, is divesting from Caterpillar and other companies that have been involved in the Israeli occupation or genocide. So there are some bright spots here and there. And I know at the university near where I live in Santa Barbara, California, Chumash Land, the Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace students got together and they passed a resolution at the Student Senate that basically denies any kind of student Senate funding to organizations that are buying products that are made by companies complicit with Israel. So there is movement, and I know that there's talk locally where I am of creating a people's university on campus. Interesting idea, interesting movement. So lastly, I just want to give you an opportunity to say some final words before we move on. And I ask everybody to stay with us because we will have an action portion of this Zoom. We're going to be calling Congress and saying, stop sending those weapons, right? Despite all that was awful that was described about the UK, apparently they are limiting some of their weapons, 30 out of 350. It is something, it's a start, I guess, to Israel. And we just need to keep pushing. So final words from John and Zahra.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Zahra, I think that you are absolutely inspirational. And I think one of the lessons that we should all learn here is that we don't have to be handcuffed by Congress. Yes, we want Congress to act, and we should constantly push Congress to act. But we can also find success in the state legislatures. And I think we should be hitting our elected officials, the mainstream media, and the status quo at every single level. You know, I say this all the time, and forgive me, this is my arrogance coming out, but we're right and they're wrong. And that's all there is to it. And so our job is to show them how wrong they are and that it's not too late to fix it. And then we can help them fix it. So thank you for the work that you've done.
Thank you, John, for joining us.
Thank you.
Congress and your words of optimism.
Thank
Zahra,
you.
Any last thoughts you want to share?
Thank you, John. Thank you, Marcy. And Marcy, you took my closing notes out of you're one step ahead of me, right? Is that just as difficult as this is, we are seeing incremental progress, right? Whether it's the shift in arms shipments from the UK, or the divestment at San Francisco State University, or all of the attention people are paying to the Green Party candidates right now. Like all of these incremental steps are a direct result of everyone's incredible hard work over the past 11 months. And so if we keep at it and we keep these levels of engagement high, I'm hopeful that we will continue to have wins. Let's lift up those wins so that we can lift up each other and keep on with this energy.
Absolutely. So true. We have to celebrate our victories, even in the face of this unfolding genocide, because this is a long haul, right? And we can't give up. We can't surrender. We have to keep pushing. And by all means, I would urge all of us to support the students as they return to school and organize again to stop Israel's genocide in Gaza. So with that, let's unmute and thank our guests, John and Zahra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, John and Zahra.
Thank you,
Thank you.